we have, Sonia and I have been here for the last week for a number of meetings, a very wonderful meeting that I'll discuss of GuideCo, which is a Chinese initiative that I hope everybody knows for global energy interconnection. It's an extremely important initiative on how to make the energy transformation. And it's an example, in my view, of China's real leadership in global sustainable development, a real gift for the world. And then we just had a birthday party yesterday. We celebrated Confucius's birthday party yesterday in Shufu. At the Nishan Forum for World Civilizations. And this was, of course, quite an impressive event. And also very moving because the Confucius Temple, if you have not been there, is 2,500 years old. At Confucius's death, he already was an esteemed teacher, and so the lands of the Kong family were preserved as a little temple. But then the emperors over many dynasties and 2 millennia continued to build new centers and temples in what would become a grand complex. And what is extraordinary about it is that it shows the continuity of Chinese civilization over a period of 2,500 years, because emperor after emperor saw fit to honor this sage whose teachings, and then through many, many generations of students and followers, built a philosophical base that actually underpins so much of China's culture until today. So it's quite remarkable. I don't think there are many places in the world like Shufu. It's hard to think of any others, in fact, where you've had continuity of 2,500 years of political recognition of a body of thought. I actually don't know of many other places like that, or none comes to mind. So it's always impressive and moving to be in China, and I'm very grateful for the chance. We are just at the end of the meeting a couple of weeks ago at the UN on the SDGs. So that's where I'd like to start our discussion, but we can also discuss any other topics and issues that you would like, because we have such a wonderful assembly of world-leading diplomats. This was the midpoint of what is to be a 15-year journey of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so there was a stock taking as well as the normal high-level debate at the General Assembly. And I think it's fair to say 2 things. One, there was a political declaration that was made by all 193 UN member states, the same as those that adopted the SDGs in the first place, that the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals remains at the center of the world agenda for building a better future. And this is good because one can imagine, with all of the tensions and distractions and crises, that maybe by midpoint, some governments would have said, we're done with this. This makes no sense. How did we get on this path? But there's no feeling like that anywhere in my experience. Also, not only last week, but as I travel around the world, the notion of the SDGs as a useful framework for national policy, local policy, regional cooperation at the level of ASEAN or level of African Union or other regional groupings, and at the global level remains very strong. It's actually a complicated agenda. So it's taken governments many, many years even to figure out what are we supposed to do with these 17 goals and these 169 targets and these 312 indicators. But it did not lead to cynicism or neglect. Actually, the agenda is a rather wonderful agenda: ending extreme poverty, ending hunger, achieving universal health coverage, achieving universal education coverage. You can't argue with it in the sense that these are really important and they have been well identified, and the governments did a good job in coming up with this list, which I thought was way too long at the beginning because I strongly recommended 10 goals. I said on the Moses principle, you could get the 10 commandments on 2 tablets, but we have 3.5 tablets at least. But it's not too much, actually. It's quite a remarkable list. That's the good side. The bad side is we're just not achieving what we set out to achieve, almost at all. And this is the real drama and the real reason for thinking what's happening. Why are we not achieving what we set out to achieve, especially since governments continue to take care of this agenda, talk about it, produce voluntary national reviews for what they are doing. We've had 188 VNRs out of the 193 countries. So why isn't the agenda working? And I think that question is coming into focus. And I would say that next year's Summit of the Future, which is a rather remarkable summit coming up, a once in maybe 2 or 3 generation summit, will be a time for really some deep reflection about why we're not achieving what we set out to achieve. And the answer is that we could achieve what we have set out to achieve, but we don't have the political and institutional base to achieve what we've set out to achieve. We've got the technology, we have the know-how, we have the global finances, we have the means to end poverty. In fact, poverty is just an anachronism in this world. It makes no sense in the year 2023. There's no deep fundamental reason for our shortfalls on any of these goals, but we don't have a system of institutions, certainly at the global level, the regional level, the national level, to accomplish what we want to accomplish. And this is frustrating for the world, actually, because we feel, on the one hand, we should be able to do this. And by this, I mean the things that I've talked about, or the energy transformation, or escaping from the growing calamities of climate change, which are very real, very serious, and accelerating. We feel we should be able to do this, and yet we can't seem to get this done properly. So this, to my mind, is what we should truly reflect on at this juncture in the world, and think about what would it take to do what we need to do. So let me give you my own reflections on that almost paradox in a way. Clear goals, goals that have been reaffirmed, goals that governments have adopted, but goals that are not being achieved. Of course, some people might say, well, they're not really achievable. These are just dreams. These are nice statements. I would strongly dispute that. There is no reason why we should have extreme poverty in the world. There's no reason why there should be hunger. There certainly is no reason in the world why hundreds of millions of children should not be in school, though they are school age. In fact, it's a scandal. It's not a puzzle, it's a scandal that this is the case. There's no reason why we should not be on a path to full decarbonization by mid-century, because technologies are now so good and the costs of zero carbon energy are now so competitive with the traditional fossil fuels that the transformation of the energy systems is absolutely within reach. But it's off track in terms of the actual implementation. So this is the puzzle. Let me start with some thoughts about what to do about the puzzle. First, China's a proof of concept. More than that, because of its scale, it's a global scale part of the solution. And this is a country that in 40 years ended extreme poverty, from rates of extreme poverty that in 1980, depending on what estimate one uses, ranged between 60 to 80% in poverty by a kind of World Bank standard. And that reached zero by 2020. Of course, China's success is the greatest success of economic development in history, so it's superlative, but it's also a demonstration of what can be accomplished. And in my view, it's a kind of roadmap also, especially for Africa right now, because what China accomplished between 1980 and 2020, Africa should accomplish between 2023 and 2063. 2063 being the 100th anniversary of the OAU and the target date for Africa to achieve its economic objectives. So it's good. We have 40 years. That's what you need. I don't think it's possible to do it faster than China, but China gives a kind of roadmap to how things can be done. And what the Chinese success in ending poverty demonstrates is the crucial role of a very high investment rate, invested properly in three areas of the economy. The first is in people, and I'd say that's the most important. China had the most extraordinary rise of education and of health that we've seen. And on education, the number of years of schooling and the quality of schooling comparing 1980 to today is absolutely magnificent. And this is the core of China's economic success, that China attained actually the first ranks of technological and scientific innovation and sophistication in 2 generations, from a country of villages after a century of upheaval, invasion, and instability. And in 40 years made a complete transformation of the human capacities, especially through education. The second investment, of course, was infrastructure. And Sonia and I arrived absolutely to the minute, on time, from Shufu to Beijing, with this wonderful infrastructure of fast rail. And I wish in the United States we had even 1 kilometer of fast rail in the whole continent. We don't have 1 kilometer of rail that goes at the speed that we went. We were watching 320 kilometers per hour the entire way. So it was a very quick journey. And that's China's infrastructure investment. This is true of rail. It's true of the highway network, of course. It's true of fiber and 5G. It's true of the power sector. China built a modern infrastructure that is continental scale, in a period of even less than the 40 years, and that supported this startlingly rapid economic development. And of course, the third pillar of investment was business investment, because the first two were mainly governmental investments, and the third pillar is business investment. And the core of the business investment is that China had an outward-oriented strategy of integrating the Chinese economy into world markets, and especially did so through the manufacturing sector, though other sectors in other places can play a similar role. But China's idea was to become deeply integrated into the world economy and to climb the technological ladder along the way until reaching not only the top of the ladder, but now the one of the leading innovative regions of the world, creating the new technologies. So that's a starting point for me in terms of what needs to be done. And I make the comparison with Africa, and I thank the UN country team here for really supporting the China-Africa partnership, because to me, this is absolutely wonderful for Africa and for China and for the world. But if you make a comparison, it's quite interesting. China, in some way, maybe not quite where Africa, not quite where China was in 1980, but a lot of poverty, probably not as extreme, actually, in a quantitative way as China in 1980, but still a large part, especially the rural population, in poverty, and absolutely a dearth of infrastructure, a low level of educational attainment in general, because kids complete 6 or 8 years of school, and then many can't continue because of fees or because of family need or poverty, or the government can't provide the school spaces and so forth. So in this sense, really an urgent need for investment in human capital, meaning education, meaning health care, and so forth. And nicely, Africa is the same population as China, 1.4 billion people, of course. The difference is the imperial powers chopped up Africa into 55 individual countries, not one of which, not even the giants, not even Nigeria, not even Ethiopia, not even DRC, is big enough economically or demographically to pull off this transformation by itself. But if you think of the African Union, like I like to do, as the equivalent of a China or an India, then you have something at scale, a continental scale, 1.4 billion people. And then I would say you have a kind of roadmap that what is needed now is high levels of investment that continue for several decades, focusing on these big 3 areas of investment: the human side, the infrastructure, and the business development. And the key to do that is, as China did, a mixed economic system that has a strong state sector and that has a strong private sector. So truly a mixed economy, and a set of institutions that can direct investment productively into the urgent areas. Now, there's a huge puzzle that stands at the center of our lack of adequate achievement, and that is how to invest this takeoff in Africa for the next 40 years. And I could speak about other regions of the world, but I'm going to focus on Africa because of the relationship and I think the need and the usefulness of China's experience in this. Right now, in the poor parts of Africa, investments are perhaps 10% of GDP, of an impoverished GDP. So last week, I spoke at a gathering at the UN for Malawi. I don't know if anybody from Malawi is here. Yes. So I was with the president, Takawera, at a very fine meeting at the UN last week. And I noted that Malawi has an income of $500 per capita, a saving rate of 0 because people are impoverished. There's nothing to save. People are trying to stay alive. The country was hit by a terrible typhoon, extraordinarily destructive. Infrastructure is very weak. Education levels very low because of the impoverishment. Saving 0. And with some development aid, investment at about 9 to 10% of national income. But think of that. What does that mean? If the income per capita is $500 per year, 10% investment means $50 per person investment rate. That is not an investment rate that's going to get Malawi out of poverty. That's an investment rate in which Malawi will continue to sink deeper and deeper into poverty. And the IMF has blessed Malawi's economic program because the IMF doesn't pay. Is there anyone from the IMF here? No. Okay. I would say the same thing anyway, but the IMF doesn't pay attention to these issues because it pays attention to the bottom line that the budget is balanced. If it's balanced in extreme impoverishment, fine, as long as it's balanced. And so Malawi has a program in which there's $50 per person of investment. The kids can't go to school because there isn't an adequate budget for that. There is not the domestic saving to get this process started. And then here's where I want to make the point. The international system doesn't pay any attention to any of this. It says, just don't overborrow. Be quiet. You'll be fine. And so sorry about that typhoon that hit you. So sorry that, as the scientists say, that was caused by human-induced climate change by the rich countries. But don't ask them to do anything about it. They deny any historical responsibility, by the way. So good luck and try to achieve the SDGs. That's more or less the reality that we're in right now. A true global system would say, my word, first, Malawi could grow 10% per year for the next 40 years. It could. Because if you're at $500 per capita, it doesn't take much to get to $1,000 per capita or $1,500 per capita. The rich countries are 100 times higher, 100 times higher, 50,000 per capita or 100,000 per capita. So the investments that are needed are not huge. So that would be the first thing that an international system would say is, we better sit down and roll up our sleeves to get this right. The second thing would be to say, we want to do what China did. So how did China do that? Well, China invested between 40 and 50% of its GDP every year. Malawi's investing 0 right now because it can't save. It's so impoverished. But once the process of development starts, the saving rate will start to rise because people will get out of mere survival mode and will start to save more. But at the beginning, there needs to be sufficient financing to get this process started. For example, there is no chance for development without an educated population, at least completing, I even hate to say this, I was going to say at least completing lower secondary universally, but really completing upper secondary, because in the 21st century, without at least an upper secondary education, what is a person going to do other than subsistence farming or completely informal, impoverished labor in a slum area, or be a migrant, or something even more desperate? So fund education. So your education minister was there, ambassador, and I said to her, Minister, calculate the education budget that you really need. You're going to find out that it's about 40% of GDP, maybe 3 times your total budget. But calculate what you really need and send an email to me and send an email to the person you're sitting next to who happened to be head of the Gates Foundation. And I said, I promise you we're going to fill your budget. I promise you. And I do promise. Okay? Because no kid should be out of school in the 21st century. And if Malawi can't do it on its own, we're going to find the way to do it. And I want to say to the executive board of the IMF, you cannot approve a plan that has an education budget in which half the kids are not, or 3/4 of the kids are not going to finish upper secondary. That's impossible. That's a death sentence for a country. So the main point, ladies and gentlemen, is financing the SDGs and creating a global system in which very poor countries can finance the SDGs, middle-income countries can finance the SDGs, and the rich countries shift their financing from the unsustainable direction to the sustainable direction. They don't have a problem with the scale of finance. They have a problem with what they use it for. But for poor countries, it's the scale of finance. So I spend most of my waking hours trying to raise finance for the SDGs, because in my view, the reason we're not accomplishing the Sustainable Development Goals is not a lack of will of poor countries, or a lack of desire, I should say. It's a complete inability to get this done, and a lack of solidarity of the rich countries and the poor countries, and a lack of functioning institutions to ensure that children are in school and that there is really electrification in countries, because you can't develop without electricity, just as you can't develop without an educated population. This is basic. And you can't leave poor people without electricity and without education, say, good luck, which is what we do right now. We say, good luck, just balance your budget and don't create trouble. Don't create debt trouble. Don't create financial trouble. Don't create any other kind of trouble. Good luck. So that's the change of the world that we need. Where are we going to get the financing from? This is what the Secretary General has proposed as the SDG stimulus. And it's a program that I've worked closely with Secretary General and with Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed on. And the basic idea is we should come up with another $500 billion to $1 trillion a year of development finance, and it wouldn't be that hard to do. And by the way, it doesn't even have to be a grant. I'm perfectly happy for Malawi to take on a huge, huge amount of debt that would be 300% of your GDP even, if it were 40-year debt. And then you had time to grow 30-fold between now and then, because then it wouldn't be 300 or 400% of GDP. We have this optical illusion. The IMF says, don't let the debt get above 30%. So don't borrow to electrify or don't borrow to put kids in school. But that's because they have a completely static view. If you borrow for those things and then emulate China with its growth rate of 10% per year, compounded for 40 years, you know, if you grow at 10% per year, you double every 7 years the size of the economy. And if you do that for 35 years, your economy is 32 times larger than it was when you started. And that's what Africa is absolutely capable of, with the kids in school, with electricity, with fast rail, with the transboundary infrastructure, so that Africa is one economy, not 55 small economies. And that's really where the breakthrough is going to come. So I'm looking for finance, and the main two areas of finance are public finance and private finance. And on the public financing side, we have a number of institutions, our multilateral development banks, that are charged with doing this. But the scale is so small now that they don't function to do what we think we're doing. You would be surprised, if you haven't looked at it, ambassadors, that the total lending of the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, added up, is $100 billion a year. $100 billion a year is, for the poor half of the world, $25 per person. This is so subscale. These institutions should be 10 times larger than they are. And that is the first recommendation of the Secretary General, a big expansion of the multilateral development banks. There's a little problem. And the little problem is that it's not really a problem, but the United States slow walks this, because to expand the banks would mean more voting shares for China, more voting shares for India, more voting shares for the developing countries, and they don't want that. And this is where one of the bottlenecks comes in, that geopolitics starts to intervene. Yes, we should have a larger World Bank, but then who's going to have the voting shares and so forth? This is not a deeply interesting question, except that it stops action in Washington. So this is an example of the problem. A different area for doing this kind of investment is the Belt and Road Initiative. I am a huge fan of the Belt and Road Initiative. I would strongly encourage every country to partner with the Belt and Road Initiative and to come celebrate its 10th anniversary next month. It's exactly what the world needs, and exactly good for the recipient countries and for China. It's actually a pure win-win proposition. China gets to sell a lot of infrastructure and a lot of technology. That's good, but it goes to build electricity, 5G, fast rail, all the infrastructure that's really needed. That's what economics is about, is mutual gains from trade. So this is an intertemporal trade. China finances the development of the recipient countries, and the recipient countries achieve economic growth, and they repay those loans when they're richer. The two criteria that I think are extremely important for the Belt and Road Initiative to pay attention to: first, the investments should be high quality, sustainable green investments. So use them for fast intercity rail. Use them for renewable energy and transmission grids and so forth. Second, from China's side, I want the lending to be at least 30-year maturity, not 10-year or 20-year maturity, but at least 30-year maturity, because otherwise there's going to be a lot of frustration. The debts will come due in 10 years, but the development's just getting started. So this is a huge problem with finance. It's not only the amounts, it's the structure of the financing. And you cannot finance long-term development with short-term loans. If you finance long-term development with short-term loans, you have a series of economic crises, which have given me a very interesting career, because I've made a career going from country to country. I realized only countries in deep crisis would have me. It's a kind of last desperation. But the truth is, these crises are what we call liquidity crises. Countries run out of money because they're maybe 1/5 of their way through long-term development, but the euro bond was a 7-year euro bond, or the loan was a 7-year bond. And by the time it came due, well, the first grader was now in 8th grade, but not yet contributing to that economic boom. So it's a little premature to start the repayment cycle, because development is just getting started. So we need long-term financing and a lot of infrastructure. So I'm also in a campaign with the IMF to change the criteria that the IMF uses to judge whether countries are in crisis right now, because you'd be surprised. The IMF has what they call the debt sustainability framework, and they rate countries: strong governance, medium governance, or weak governance. Almost all poor countries have weak governance, not surprisingly, because they're always with the back to the wall. And they say to the weak government, don't borrow more than 30% of GDP. And I say, are you kidding? 30% of $500 per capita? Don't borrow more than $150? That's not going to get you very far. Because I say, when I do my spreadsheet, borrow to 400% of GDP. But then, as I say, 40 years of fast growth brings that way down to completely manageable levels by the time the debt is due. So the IMF has a very short-term viewpoint. The credit rating agencies, as they even admitted to me, Mr. Sachs, we don't know anything about development. What we do know about is default risks, and these are high default risk countries. And I say, yes, but if they had the right development framework. And they say, but Mr. Sachs, we don't know anything about development. We just try to predict default risks. So I'm trying to argue for a long-term partnership vision, a reform of the international financial institutions, a new way of thinking about the problem, looking at China not only as a great success story, but also as a kind of roadmap for what a high investment strategy can mean for today's low-income countries, or what it would mean suitably adjusted, say, for the ASEAN region or for South American countries. Because I believe that the essence of sustainable development is investment in our future. And I don't want China to become, as they're told all the time in the US, stop exporting to us, stop saving so much, you should consume more. I don't buy this at all. China saves a lot because it's aging fast and it wants to build up a high level of wealth. Good. But let that wealth be a claim against Malawi. It's a good bet. Malawi has a huge rate of return. By the way, when you do the calculation, the rate of return to development is just about the best rate of return in the world. I think it's comparable to every one of our unicorn companies. My calculation is that the rate of return to investing in Africa's development is about 15% annual rate of return, but it takes 40 years to realize. So that's the internal rate of return over a 2-generation effort. And I'm very conscious that the newborn today will not yield that return until they're 30 years old, because they have to go to through upper secondary and then 4 years of university at least. And then by the time that they're 22 or 23, they can enter the labor market, and then they'll start repaying hugely. But that takes the time. But the cumulative rate of return is extremely high. Development is a great rate of return activity if you give it the time. And so that, to my mind, is really where the SDGs are right now. We're terribly distracted, terribly confused. Our governments do not play well together. The United States, unfortunately, criticizes the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the best initiative in the whole world on long-term development. So not only not a proper object of criticism, but it should be an object both of praise and to say, we want to partner. And with Europe, please partner. You're on the same landmass. The Eurasian landmass needs an interconnected infrastructure. Of course. The Silk Roads was the first example of that. That's the model of the Belt and Road Initiative, is the Silk Roads. Okay, that required a lot of horses over a long distance. We can now have a 21st century infrastructure. So for Europe, build from the West towards the East. China will help finance investment from the East towards the West. Celebrate in Samarkand that you have connected Eurasia together, again in a 21st century Silk Road, and let's cooperate. And I know the United States calls some leaders and says, maybe you should not be part of the Belt and Road Initiative. This has happened last month in the White House and so on. Please don't do this. This is ridiculous. This isn't a game. This is our world. This should be partnership. This should be cooperation. There should be dialogue to get this right. And Europe and China should really be cooperating on getting this right. I'll say one more thing and then I'll stop. And that is that wherever you look in the world, my economic advice is be nice to your neighbors. Because economies work better at scale. They work through trade and transport. And your neighbor is on your transport route, whether you like it or not. They're your neighbor. Africa, by the way, has 14 landlocked countries. The coastal countries and the landlocked countries need to be friends. We need an integrated infrastructure. And that's true of Eurasia, it's true of Africa, it's true of South America. The GuideCo initiative that I mentioned at the start is an initiative for interconnecting the energy system. It's a wonderful idea. And by the way, the engineers of GuideCo, which was created by China's State Grid, are the best in the world at these interconnections, because China had to bring power from Western China to the Eastern seaboard. So they've developed a lot of the best technologies for high voltage direct current systems and their management. But that's interconnection with the neighbors. So I'm completely against Cold War politics, where you're on one side and you're on the other side. Come on. This is really absolutely not the right way to think about any of our real problems. Neighbors share riversheds, neighbors share rainforests, neighbors share fisheries, neighbors share inland seas, neighbors share renewable energy potential. Neighbors need to cooperate and to be nice to each other. So, as they say, look to your left, look to your right, to your north, to your south, make friends. Thank you.
Actually, the first lie came when the Soviet Union shot down a CIA spy plane, the U-2 spy plane with Gary Powers, just on the eve of what was supposed to be a summit between Eisenhower and Soviet Party Chairman Nikita Khrushchev. And the CIA lies for a living, we know this, but it lied to the President of the United States also, saying, Mr. President, don't worry, they can't shoot down the spy plane, it's too high, and if they do shoot down the spy plane, it's designed to disintegrate, and if it doesn't disintegrate anyway, the pilot is going to take his cyanide pill, and there's no way anything can happen to embarrass you. And of course, they shoot down the spy plane, they get the wreckage, they get the pilot alive, Gary Powers. They don't announce that. They say we have been spied upon and downed a plane without revealing those details. And Eisenhower comes out and says, no, this is a weather craft that went off course from Turkey. And then the Soviets reveal, we have the fuselage, we have the pilot who has told us about his spy mission, direct, blatant lies. Then soon after this comes the direct, blatant lies of the Bay of Pigs. It's dangerous. And this is the CIA, by the way, and it's the CIA till today, in my view. It is lying and unaccountable and really never called to task for these lies because the public doesn't know them, doesn't understand what's going on. But from the Soviet U.S. point of view, within months of the Kennedy administration, this air was poisoned. And there was one other thing that was absolutely precipitating all of this, which was, and very fundamental and completely never discussed in America almost at all, but there had been no peace treaty at the end of World War II. And the Cold War emerged, in fact, over a bitter dispute between the Soviet Union and the United States about the future of Germany. The Soviet Union had lost more than 20 million people in the war and did not want to see German remilitarized. The United States, on the other hand, decided that the three occupied regions from the western side, the US, French, and British regions, would form a single new Federal Republic of Germany. The remaining fourth part, the Soviet-occupied part, would become the German Democratic Republic, the GDR. But the western side would become the bulwark of a new military alliance, NATO, and it would be remilitarized. And the Soviet Union said, no, we just lost more than 20 million people. Now, within a few years, you're remilitarizing. Well, of course, the United States never listened, never negotiated, and at the end of the 1950s, took another step. Eisenhower was flirting with the idea, maybe we should just give our allies control over nuclear weapons as well, so we can reduce the U.S. Troops numbers in Europe. Eisenhower was very frugal. He was a fiscal conservative, and he wanted to bring troops home and use the nuclear shield. And so there was, at the end of the 1950s, lots of talk about nuclear sharing. And this was freaking out the Soviet Union also. And the United States doesn't know how to talk to anybody. There's no diplomacy. There are mortal enemies. There's no one to negotiate. And so the situation, by the time Kennedy came in, was completely fraught. Then came the Bay of Pigs. Then Khrushchev said, okay, we need to teach Americans a bit of their own lessons. We'll put missiles in Cuba. And Khrushchev had a quite remarkable exchange with Andrei Gromyko, his foreign minister. Gromyko said, "No, what, war?" And Khrushchev said, "No, not war, just basically teach these Americans about their arrogance. They have missiles in Turkey. We're going to put missiles in Cuba. Nothing about war." But of course, everything immediately spiraled out of control when the missile placements were discovered and the subterfuge that the Soviets were using to place the missile systems in place. And it was like the subterfuge of the United States doing what it did on its side. Things get out of hand. And as soon as Kennedy saw the U-2 spy plane over Cuba taking these pictures of missile sites, he convened an executive committee, ExComm, and it was almost unanimous. Well, we got to shoot down these sites. We have to take them out before they can be deployed. And it was unanimous, essentially, that there needed to be an immediate war, and the Joint Chiefs were told to go off and plan the military campaign against Cuba. Would it be an air campaign? Would it just be to take out the sites? How many troops would be needed, and so forth? Kennedy, interestingly, to make a very long story short, had lunch by coincidence with Adlai Stevenson, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, on the first day of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Kennedy had seen the pictures. And Adlai Stevenson said to Kennedy, "Well, of course you need diplomacy to end this, and exchange the missiles with the Turkish missiles." Kennedy was shocked because no other advisor had said anything about diplomacy. It was basically unanimous for a military approach, which, by the way, almost surely may be too strong, although I'm not sure it is, but most likely would have led to nuclear annihilation. Because our doctrine was that if we were attacked by a nuclear weapon, we would give a full response. By the way, full meaning not only the Soviet Union, but Eastern and Central Europe, China, hundreds of millions of people killed. And now we learned afterwards from the nuclear winter, maybe all of humanity perishing from starvation afterwards. But Stevenson laid the idea of maybe a negotiated settlement. Well, to make a long story short, as people know, Kennedy really almost alone, though with this hint from Stevenson, and then with his brother Robert pushing, and Ted Sorensen pushing, and a few others pushing, turned the tide over a few days that don't do something precipitous. Let's try to figure out what's in Khrushchev's mind. And Kennedy came to realize, because he had people like the Air Force head, Curtis LeMay, who just wanted nuclear war, it seems, or a first strike against the Soviet Union, that he was surrounded by a lot of hotheads who could end the world. And he realized Khrushchev probably was as well. And the two of them came to realize we better tamp this down. And they did. And they agreed on a deal of this removal of missiles, both from Cuba and from Turkey. The big mistake Kennedy made, and I always think it's unfair to call it a mistake because he saved the world, so you get a lot of credit for that. But the mistake he made was insisting that the deal be secret, so that it looked to the American people like he had simply faced down the Soviet Union and they had backed away, because it wasn't known that the removal of the American missiles were part of an exchange. And that wasn't known for decades, actually.
So let's talk about how Kennedy changed and what he set out to do. And of course, it was all cut short by his assassination in November of 1963.
I think first it's fair to say that being president of the United States is a tough job. And it's impossible to do right in the early days and early years because you don't get it. and our security state in the United States, which was created by the National Security Act of 1947, which created a secret security state and a private army of the United States called the CIA, which is one half its function because it does intelligence and it does private warfare of the United States. And the whole apparatus is secret and largely out of control. And it is absolutely out of control by any public understanding or scrutiny or accountability or congressional oversight today as it was in the early 1960s. Well, Kennedy came in with a lot of energy and idealism and brilliance, and he stumbled terribly in the first year with the Bay of Pigs, Cuban invasion, and then in the second year, the near disaster of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And my view is he had the potential for greatness at the beginning, and by his third year, he had become a magnificent politician and statesman of the first order, one of our truly great presidents. Not so much in the first 2 years, although the potential was there, but the growth that came through this set of trials was extraordinary. Already after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy was so disturbed by the CIA that he was beside himself about how they had led the U.S. and his administration and himself personally into this awful debacle. He didn't trust the CIA. After the Cuban Missile Crisis and after hearing people like Curtis LeMay even essentially calling Kennedy a traitor for not launching the war or a coward, and feeling all of this pressure for war, he was profoundly disturbed and profoundly moved and profoundly scared at how fragile the world was. And he was determined to do something in 1963. And let
me just interject. He fired Dulles and he fired Bissell. So he actually took on the CIA establishment and triggered deep animus. And I want you, as you go on, to talk about this speech. But one of the things I found fascinating from your book is how few people he informed about what it was he was about to say. And so I want to make sure we talk about the content of what he said.
So Kennedy wanted to say to the American people, peace is possible, even with the Soviet Union, even with the other side. And the whole content of the speech is they are human beings like we are. They want to live. They want to protect their children. They want to have a future. And this speech is unbelievable because it's the only foreign policy speech I know of anywhere where it is not telling the other side what to do, not making threats, not reveling in glory, not saying we are number one, not saying they are evil, but saying to the American people, we need to reconsider our own position. And remember, today we're told every day by the completely irresponsible, reckless, and ignorant mass media like the New York Times, I'm going to say, because it's terrible, and like the Washington Post and others, there's no one to talk to. There's no one to negotiate with over Ukraine. And in the Cold War in 1963, it was even more like that. The Cuban Missile Crisis had just occurred. Could you even imagine negotiating with the Soviet Union? And Kennedy's whole message is, we can negotiate. They want the same things. They too will abide by treaties as long as those treaties are also in their interest. And they can be relied upon to abide by treaties that are in their interest and also in our interest. There is a benefit of cooperation. This is rational. In fact, the pursuit of peace is the rational end of rational men, says President Kennedy.
I just want to read a couple sections because it is an absolutely remarkable, and as you point out, through Sorensen, beautifully elegiac and just gorgeously written. But these are some of the things. I want to read 3 short sections. I speak of peace, this is Kennedy, as the necessary rational end of rational men. I realize that the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war. And frequently the words of the pursuer fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. And then he says, so let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. And just to conclude, he asks in the speech, what kind of peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and to build a better life for their children, not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women, not merely peace in our time, but peace for all time. I mean, this is incredible.
It gives you goosebumps. Of course, I've listened, I don't know how many dozens or hundreds of times to the speech. I've made my family listen on so many occasions. But the words are thrilling. The words are mesmerizing in their beauty, and Ted Sorensen has a big hand in that as well. And in their ability to make change. And I think one of the things that Kennedy also says in here, which is incredible, is his advice on leadership. And I don't have exactly the words here, but to paraphrase, he says, by defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. So the goal of peace, if made to be manageable, practical, like a treaty to stop atomic testing stop atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons, is a practical, manageable step, and people draw hope from it. So the speech was so riveting and powerful. By the way, kept completely outside of the bureaucracy. It was essentially hidden from the security apparatus, from the State Department, the CIA, even the White House. Only Sorensen and Kennedy worked on it basically until the last moment. Then they said, I'm giving this. Kennedy said, I'm giving it. So it could not be vetoed by state or by the Defense Department or the National Security Council or anybody else. And he gave it. And what is amazing, absolutely amazing, is that Khrushchev heard it, was carried away, summoned the U.S. envoy, Kennedy's envoy, to Moscow, Averell Harriman, and said, this is the finest speech by an American president since FDR. I want to make peace with your president. The words were so powerful. The motivation, the ideas were so powerful. Kennedy disseminated the speech through Pravda, Izvestia, online.
Isn't that hilarious? Pravda reprinted it.
Exactly, and broadcast the speech. And within a few weeks, they had signed the agreement. Within a few weeks. Absolutely an astounding achievement. Then Kennedy, just to say, he was also the grassroots politician. He was a political guy to the core. He went out to campaign for it. And so he took his tour around the United States. The Joint Chiefs, oh, well, we don't know. They come to testify in Congress and try to knock down this agreement. And Kennedy carried the American public overwhelmingly, and then won a decisive victory in the Senate 60 years ago, just now, for the ratification of this treaty. And this is the time when we're talking is the time of the UN General Assembly. Kennedy went to tell the leaders what this meant in another completely magnificent address. And he said, this is not the end of conflict, but it is a ray of hope piercing through the clouds. And he ends his address to the world leaders assembled in front of him in the chamber of the UN General Assembly. Kennedy, having brought peace, brought hope, and all the world leaders assembled in front of him. And he says to them that Archimedes is said to have told his friends, "Give me a place to stand and I can move the world." Fellow leaders of the world, let us see if we can take our stand here in this place, in this time, to move the world towards peace. And you just can't get better than that. The idealism, the hope, the practicality, and Kennedy infused the whole world with it. And then they killed him.
And we've lost it. We've lost it.
And they killed him because I'm personally convinced, after having studied this in depth for decades now, and now we have the report completely debunking the Warren Commission with the magic bullet being no magic bullet at all, but a bullet that the Secret Service pulled out of the back of Kennedy's seat and put on the stretcher, debunking the entire forensic basis of the Warren Commission. I'm pretty convinced that it was rogue elements within the U.S. government itself.
Well, Alan Dulles.
Alan Dulles,
Can't
CIA.
get more evil. Can't get more evil than that.
Exactly. We don't know exactly who, but this was a conspiracy, and it was a conspiracy against peace. And it's our security state is in full force. Our president, in my view, is not in control. And in any event has been a hardliner and a Cold Warrior, whatever you want to call it, well past the Cold War. These neocons don't understand peace. They don't understand negotiation. They don't understand diplomacy. They don't understand the nuclear threat. And one other point, Chris, of the speech that I think is so pertinent and completely neglected, Kennedy says, above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. And the U.S. has gone out to humiliate Putin and to defeat Putin. And Russia has 6,000 nuclear weapons. What are we doing? What are we thinking? Of course, I take it a little bit, even a step back. I think this is, I call it the war of NATO enlargement, because I think the entire war in Ukraine came because the United States so recklessly and imprudently kept pushing NATO enlargement. Russia saying, stop. It's a red line. Stop. And then not to Ukraine, for heaven's sake, not to Ukraine, our 2,300 kilometer border, not to surround us in the Black Sea. And the U.S. is deaf to this. And then trying to humiliate Putin and doing exactly the opposite of what Kennedy said. And I take it seriously when Kennedy says in that remark about not pushing a nuclear power to a corner, he says, above all, as if that's the synthesis of what he's learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis. Above all, don't humiliate a nuclear adversary. And our people don't even know it. We don't have diplomats, and we don't have a president, in my view, that understands the job of keeping the foot on the brake. So it's a very dangerous time.
Would you agree that China is using this Hamiltonian approach to economics, perhaps coming from Sun Yat-sen, whose influence who is highly influenced by Hamilton?
Well, China has what I would simply call a mixed economy, which means it's partly state-directed, partly market-directed. I think all successful economies are mixed economies. And the U.S., even when it uses free market rhetoric, of course, has a large role of the government, not necessarily accurate role, but a large role of government in the economy. Different countries come down differently on how they carve up the relative weights and responsibilities of public, private, and civil society sectors. It's true that the UK, US approach is relatively more on the laissez-faire side. I'd say relatively more. We're lower taxes, certainly as a share of national income, a much lower social outlays. The UK more than the United States, even though it started with laissez-faire in the 19th century. The UK adopted a national health service, of course, after World War II. The United States never did that. China's a very pragmatic and economically well-governed country. Very impressive during the past 40 years because they've had a planning model with a major role of state finance combined with a very dynamic and competitive market sector and a very entrepreneurial lead in many sectors as well. I was just in China and noted a huge rise of electric vehicles. And there are hundreds of electric vehicle companies right now, startups. It's expected that the number will whittle down quickly to perhaps between 5 and 10 such companies. But right now it's named to be in the hundreds of companies producing electric vehicles. And it's a fiercely competitive market inside China. Now, when it comes to the international side, China's just doing a lot of things that the United States did for a while after World War II, which was help finance infrastructure abroad, make the way for U.S. multinational companies, in fact. And China right now is doing that. The United States doesn't do much internationally at all other than war, but it doesn't do peaceful economic development activities, and you can see in the rhetoric of American leaders, politicians, their resentment that China dares to help other countries to build infrastructure. You know, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a very valid and quite beneficial win-win program of China, together with more than 150 other countries, by the way, is badmouthed every day by the United States, mainly out of resentment and jealousy, because the U.S. doesn't have that kind of spirit to make connections with other countries. And China is making massive investments and working with other countries to help them with developing an electric power grid, basic renewable energy sources, fast rail, 5G technologies, paved roads and highways, and many other desirable things that those counterpart countries really need. Now Biden is talking about a road project from India to the Mideast. And he's so proud of this one road. It doesn't exist. It's not financed. It's it may be a good idea, but it's a little pathetic, actually, to tell you the truth, because China has dozens of projects like this all over the world. The United States has thought about one. Literally, I guess they took the one belt, one road idea, but they took one road. There's one corridor that they're talking about, whereas China is doing dozens of these projects. So the U.S. is kind of looking on
I
since
think
we're
that
so
IMEC program is dead with the war now in
yes, I think that's right. And we're so paralyzed, so ineffective, so paralyzed with everything, so war driven, that an idea of a road becomes about the best that we can do, and a road that perhaps never will be built.
right. Okay, well, look, I'll come back to China, but I also knew that you were at the Valdai discussion club, and I was told actually by Richard Sakwa, whom I interviewed yesterday, whom you know, he was also speaking at Valdai, but he told me that you were speaking there on the question of the discussion for a new currency and a new international trade mechanism that's taking place within the BRICS. I think you know that Sergei Glaziev, who has been a key economist in formulating these ideas, working with China and the other BRICS countries, and now really the whole global South, working on putting together this kind of idea. And you probably know that Lyndon LaRouche, that Glaziev has openly praised Lyndon LaRouche's economic ideas, and especially the article he wrote in the year 2000, which was called "Toward a Basket of Hard Commodities: Trade Without Currency." So perhaps you can say a bit about where you think that whole plan stands today. I was not able to find the video of your presentation at Valdai, so I'm counting on you to fill us in.
Basically, I noted that having one dominant currency in the world, which has been the U.S. dollar after World War II, and which was the pound sterling before World War I, has certain advantages because money is just a means of settling transactions for the real economy, for the non-monetary economy. So having a single currency can be efficient, but the U.S. Has blown it by weaponizing the dollar. The U.S. Had an advantage because other countries and international businesses use the dollar, and that does give benefits to the U.S., so-called seniorage benefits and other benefits, but essentially the ease of borrowing abroad and very high liquidity of your own national currency. But the U.S. started to weaponize the dollar, meaning rather than letting it be used just for transactions purposes, the United States used this special situation of having transactions pass through the dollar banking system and ultimately through the central bank of the U.S., the Federal Reserve, to start confiscating the dollars of other countries that the U.S. disagreed with in foreign policy. This is really obnoxious behavior, by the way, because the idea of money is, again, as a transactions medium, not as a hostage to foreign policy. And because the dollar was so dominant, even after the U.S. confiscated reserves of Iran or North Korea, then Venezuela, now Russia, many countries use the dollar, but they don't like to use it because they're a little afraid of saying a word that's cross to the U.S. and then seeing the U.S. government come down on them, even freezing their money. It's pretty bad behavior, in my view, but basically very ill-advised because the BRICS countries now, and it started with the original five, with Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, but now it's going to include the new six, which is Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Iran. This is a big group of countries, and they're saying, we don't want to use the dollar because, frankly, we don't want our money confiscated. And so they're going to develop an alternative payments system. They will be successful at that because it's not so hard to make payments in other ways. in renminbi or in rubles or rupees or in an R5 currency, so-called, because the original BRICS 5 all have an R currency. The real, the ruble, the rupee, the renminbi, and the rand. So they call it the R5, and they may just make a basket using those 5 currencies for denomination and even for lending and borrowing in a bond denominated in a basket of currencies. So I expect something interesting and good to come out of this. Again, it's a little bit regrettable in a way if having a single medium of exchange, it wouldn't even have to be one country. Keynes had the idea that it would be the IMF's currency, the Bancor, he called it in a famous writing, would have certain convenience. But if it's then used monopolistically for militarized or foreign policy or geopolitical purposes, it's not going to last long, because there are always workarounds when it comes to trade and to financial settlements. And that's what the BRICS are doing right now. They're going to do a workaround.
I sent you, just before we got on this call, a article that was published by Glaziev, I think just today, or at least recently, on this, in which he emphasizes that while the basket of currencies and the R5, these are definitely being implemented already in various forms, but that eventually the idea of a separate currency, maybe the R5, but some separate currency which would be also tied to a basket of commodities rather than just currencies, to, in a certain sense, tie it to the cost, the actual cost of production of the real economy. And that in general, he thinks this is something that it's basically simple to finish completing it, that he's hopeful that it can be done by next year when Russia is head of the BRICS and will be holding the BRICS conference in Kazan, I believe. So anyway, I'd be interested in your response to his article.
Yeah, I haven't read it yet. Let me just say that there are several different issues involved in our discussion. One is the privilege of the U.S. to host the international currency, and I've explained why the U.S. has misused that privilege and why it's now going to lose a lot of the business, so-called, of settlements in dollars. But a second is the mechanics of payment systems, and the third is the management of monetary policy. These are all distinct issues. On the payments mechanisms, we can do something that could never have been done before, and that is digital settlements. So we don't even need a banking system now, and we don't need cash in circulation or gold bars and other or gold coins and other mechanisms that were mechanisms of settlement, because now digitally every transaction can be tracked. We know there are different ways to do it. Blockchain is one, but there are many other probably more efficient ways to do it with central bank clearing, for example. And that means that even the method of payments, I think, will likely be digital and could well be a central bank digital currency in the future. Then third question is the management of monetary policy. And this is a long debate. John Maynard Keynes wrote brilliantly about it in the 1920s and the 1930s. Should a currency, whether digital or physical, be convertible into something else, for example, gold, or into some commodity basket, or should it be what economists call a fiat currency, which is that it is only backed by the policies of the central bank or banks that issue that currency, and its value depends on expectations about those policies. And we've had more than 100 years of debate about that. The advantage of linking a currency to a commodity basket is it can't be issued for political purposes, especially to finance government payments not backed by a flow of tax revenues, for example. So you can't get a hyperinflation in a backed currency. And that's been deemed to be the advantage, that it is a kind of straitjacket and focuses on the real economy, limits the capacity to issue credit. But on the other hand, it proved to be highly disadvantageous in other circumstances. When the world was on a gold standard or a gold exchange standard, if there were long periods in which major gold deposits were not discovered, that gave, on average, a deflationary weight to the world price trends, and that was deemed to have distributional and real economy effects that were not highly desirable, although it also had some desirable effects as well. It also made it harder for central banks to be lenders of last resort in financial panics. And the Great Depression is a very complicated, fascinating, and important subject to understand about central banking and whether the gold standard was a contributor to the persistence of the Great Depression. Well, I don't want us to get into long excursus about monetary theory, except to say that there are several questions on the table right now. First, whose currency? Second, the technology of settlement. And third, the organization of monetary policy. They're all very interesting. I spent many decades studying them, and I think there's no ideal systems here, which is why we continue to have these discussions decade after decade after decade.
Right. Well, getting back to China, I did listen to your presentation in Beijing I think it was at the UN headquarters there, to, I think probably
Group of
international ambassadors, yeah.
Yep.
And probably Chinese officials as well, right? But anyway, yeah, it was very interesting. I mean, you really focused on the Chinese miracle, the transformation of China over a mere 40 years into, from one of the poorest to one of the richest in history, actually, and the transformation of elimination of poverty and so forth. So, I mean, this was a quite interesting presentation. What I really found interesting was your discussion of the idea that the Chinese model would be the proper approach for dealing with the development of Africa, which of course is also very much part of China's role in the Belt and Road. But in particular, you contrasted that directly to the policies of the IMF, which I thought I'd ask you to elaborate on here, because it was a very interesting way of showing the failure of the IMF to bring about real development in Africa or any other part of the developing sector.
I think, to put it very straightforwardly, the rapid economic growth of China, which was by traditional measures around 10% per year growth of the domestic economy, persistently between 1980 and nearly the year 2020. So an increase that was more than 30-fold, if you accumulate, in the size of the Chinese economy, came about by investment. What does investment mean? Investment means building the capital stock of a country. What is a capital stock? A capital stock means the productive assets of an economy. What are those? Well, those are three main categories. First, what we carry in our own bodies and brains, the so-called human capital. That's the education and the skills and the health of the population. The second is the physical infrastructure, which is the roads, the power grid, the fiber optics grid, the water and sewerage systems, and fast rail highways, all of the networking that the economy depends on. And the third is the business sector, the manufacturing industries, agriculture, and so forth. Well, if you look at China's growth during 1980 to 2020, the rates of investment were extraordinary. The rate of investment means essentially the share of the national income that is invested each year in new capital. And in the United States, the gross investment rate, which means the amount of investment that we undertake, not recognizing that some of it's just offsetting depreciation, the gross investment is something on the order of 15 to 20% of the national income. But in China, it was typically 40 to 50% of the national income. So a supercharged investment rate. You know, before our eyes, China built thousands of kilometers of fast rail, thousands of kilometers of a highway system, thousands of kilometers of an electricity distribution system, and on and on and on. Really impressive. And that's what powered China. That plus the huge investments in education and skills. So China started without much infrastructure at all, and it started with very poor education levels by the late 1970s because China had had so much turmoil over the preceding 150 years. But then China finally, starting in 1978, said, okay, we're going for it. Deng Xiaoping came to power. He was perhaps modern history's single most successful economic reformer. He pointed China in the right direction, said, go for growth, open the economy, make a market economy, make a mixed economy, build infrastructure, invest in the people. And lo and behold, that extraordinarily high investment rate led to 40 years of rapid growth. Now, the problem when it comes to the IMF is that the IMF does not have that vision in mind. The IMF's vision to a finance minister of a poor country is, don't bother us with your problems. Don't get into excessive debt. Don't get into a financial crisis, and don't bother us about your poverty. Thank you very much. So nobody thinks very hard about the way for these countries to get out of poverty, but the way is just like China did, which is massive investments. And then comes the question how to finance those investments. China partly borrowed in the early years, but also had a massively high saving rate internally. So as the income was rising, China wasn't consuming it in a lot of household consumer spending. Chinese households were saving a lot of their rising income. Chinese businesses were reinvesting a lot of their profits. The government wasn't running huge deficits on its current transactions and so forth. All of this meant a very high saving rate that could be turned into a high investment rate. Now, Africa right now has a very, very low saving rate because people are impoverished. They can't save more. They have to survive. So they need some help with the financing right now by essentially some international financing, say from the African Development Bank or from the Belt and Road program, in which China can provide some of the financing to build that infrastructure in Africa. But that's the advice that Africa should be getting. Invest strongly, invest heavily, borrow where you need to borrow, get your kids in school, electrify the economy, build the roads, build the fast rail, and so forth. And I think China can help to give some very good advice in that direction.
The China model. Right.
Yeah, China shows, you can have 40 years of supercharged growth, and that's what Africa needs.
40 years. Yeah, I agree. You also spoke at Chufu, the birthplace of Confucius, which now is a shrine and a museum, I believe, right? A major site.
Well, that temple, the Confucian temple, has been there for more than 2,000 years. And each emperor has come and added a stone, added an inscription, added calligraphy, because Confucius has been an intellectual hero and guidepost for China basically for 2,500 years. So it's really impressive to be there at a Confucius birthday party, which I was, because this goes back essentially 2,500 years, and it's a large complex of buildings because emperor after emperor added their own building to it. So you really get the feel of China's very long, remarkable history.
Right. And you focus there on the idea that we find our common humanity by studying the great philosophers and thinkers of every culture. In particular, you looked at Confucius and Buddha and Aristotle. I think I would differ with you on Aristotle and would have focused on Plato rather than Aristotle. But that's a discussion for another time. But in any case, this idea of looking at the great cultures and the history, the best moments of the great cultures, is the exact opposite of so-called geopolitics, which is what guides the Western leaders today, deriving from ideologues like Alfred Mackinder and other ideologues of the British Empire. So, which their view is that the only way to advance is by putting down the other guy, the opposite of the interest of the other, and rather, and this, of course, leads to the sanctions policy. You didn't mention the sanctions when you talked about the theft of reserves, but even the sanctions policy, as I understand it, is based on the fact that people have to use the dollar in trade, and that therefore they think they have a right to impose these sanctions on countries. But in any case, China, of course, is not looking to suppress anybody else, and the massive sanctions against China and Russia and many other countries indicates a failure of thinking in terms of the great cultures and what can be done with a culture for the future. So how do we restore that looking to the great minds of antiquity in the West?
I think that there are two philosophical points that we really need to pay attention to that are quite fascinating, quite deep. One is the question of human nature, and the philosophers that I referred to, and I like Aristotle personally, but also I like the fact that Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius allow us to talk about the ABCs of philosophy. So it's getting back to the core ABCs. And what the ABCs, Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius had in mind about human nature is that it is potentially good, meaning that with proper cultivation, proper education, proper mentoring, living in a decent community, people can learn to be harmonious. People can learn to be fair, trustworthy. People can learn reciprocity. So this is sometimes called virtue ethics, the idea that people can be decent, pretty good. Now, there's another philosophical strain which is deeply pessimistic. Augustine in Christian history is the exemplar of that. Man is fallen, and so man is a sinner, and there's no way out except perhaps by God's grace. But the sinfulness can't be washed away. And pessimists in history have believed that. And another pessimist like that had a huge influence is my second dimension, which is how people behave or how states interact. And Hobbes, in a way, is a follower of Augustine. Hobbes, of course, wrote in the 1600s, whereas Augustine was more than a millennium earlier than that. But Hobbes was the quintessential British philosopher who said people are rapacious, they are greedy, they are pushy, they are violent. And the best you can hope for is that someone controls them from killing each other. So he called for a very tight, centralized state for that purpose. But basically, the Hobbesian idea is that you can't do anything in a state of nature, but defend yourself from being killed by someone else. And strangely enough, while British thinkers accepted that there would be a national government that would stop people from killing each other inside Britain, they took the view that internationally, it is a Hobbesian war of all against all, that just countries fight with each other. And this is in the current thinking of international relations known as the realist school. And our leading realist thinker in the United States is John Mearsheimer at University of Chicago. He's a wonderful person and a tremendous gentleman and a great scholar. But he thinks that countries are, and especially great powers, are inevitably at each other's throats. And unfortunately, there's a lot of empirical evidence that this is often the case. But John Mearsheimer says the implication of this is that the world is tragic. His most famous book is called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, because he says conflict is just about inevitable between major powers because nobody trusts each other. You can't trust each other. It's a war of all against all. It's eat or be eaten, kill or be killed. And so, yes, life's tragic. And I debate him. Again, we're friends and I admire him a lot. I want to be clear. But I say, John, we can't accept tragedy as our fate. We have to do better than that. And so I go back to the philosophers. And the philosophers taught, you can have harmony. That was Confucius's main message, which is it's possible actually to be decent. It's possible to observe what was famous for Confucius, and in similar terms for us in the Western culture as the golden rule. Do not do to others what you would not have them do to you. If you're a Hobbesian, you say, there goes Sachs moralizing, but that's not how the world is. I'm going to do what I can to the others because otherwise they're going to do something terrible to me and I'm going to get there first. And I say no.
Because that's human nature. That's what they are.
Because that's the deep human nature. That's inevitable.
Yeah, right.
But I don't believe it. It's certainly not the case that we're always at war against each other. We can be better than that. But by the way, China absolutely has a different history and a different mindset. And this is also a fascinating point. It's not just Confucius versus Hobbes. It's actually history. 2,000 years of statecraft. What have we learned? Well, in China, for most of the 2,000 years, there was a centralized state. This is very important. For most of the 2,000 years, there was the Han dynasty, or the Tang dynasty, or the Song dynasty, or the Yuan dynasty, or the Ming dynasty, or the Qing dynasty, or today the People's Republic of China. And for most of that 2,000 years, there was one country. And while there were rebellions and there were a lot of invasions from the north, mainly from the nomadic peoples in the dryland, grassland, steppe regions, there was one country, big population. Now in Europe, after 476 AD, when the Roman Empire fell in the West, there never again was one dominant power of Western Europe. So there was war nonstop. Think of Britain and France, for example. How many years were they at war during the past 1,000 years? An incredible amount across the channel. Now compare that with China and Japan. How many years were China and Japan at war between, well, you could take it back before 1000 AD, but say from 1000 AD to 1890? The answer is 2 years. I think it's 1274 and 1281, if I remember correctly. And there was actually one incursion a third year. Now, two of those were when the Mongols ruled China and they tried to invade Japan and failed on 2 occasions. Once was when a shogun, a military commander of Japan, ridiculously tried to invade China and was terribly defeated in the Korean Peninsula. But my point is not that. My point is they didn't fight for 1,000 years. Barely a skirmish. By the way, when Japan industrialized and was the first industrializing nation, Japan followed the realist approach, sadly. Japan said, okay, now we're part of the imperial club. Now we're going to go invade China. And the Chinese diplomat said, what are you doing? We're Asians. And Japan said, no, now we're part of the Western club. This was back in the 1890s. So Japan really behaved badly by becoming an imperialist power for some period, but China never did in that way. And if we understand the different philosophical roots, this is crucial. If we understand the different experience of Europe and China, we can come to appreciate that our mindset in the West that, well, it's war all the time, so China's an enemy, so we better go at it, is nothing the way that China thinks. And when I said to John Mearsheimer, again, I want to stress, a friend and and a brilliant scholar, when I said all this warmongering against China is going to create a self-fulfilling prophecy of war, he said, yes. I said, John, self-fulfilling, we don't need to have that war. He said, yes, but that's how it is. And yeah. I said, no, we don't need to have it that way. We can do better than that. So that's the debate.
Helga issued what she calls the 10 principles for an architecture of security and development for the world as a whole. And most of them are sort of self-evident. You need education, you need cultural training, you need health, so forth. But the 10th principle is exactly what you just brought up, that the nature of man is good. And this is the one that's most difficult for people to accept or understand. But it's the fundamental one. It's really the issue, as I think you correctly just located. This is what distinguishes the idea of being committed to global development rather than global war. And of course, as you said, also the Confucian concept of harmony and the concentration on education is really the center of the Chinese development of their own country over the last 40 years. And what's now being taken out to the rest of the world through the Belt and Road. And as you know, we just had the Belt and Road third Belt and Road Forum in Beijing with 150 countries represented, which certainly demonstrates that they've failed miserably in the isolation of China in the world, and that the idea that they could get countries to decouple from China has just forced most countries to say, you're crazy. This is where development is rather than war and sanctions. And in fact, the headline of our EIR this week is going to be on the fact that Xi Jinping offered a $100 billion new investments through the Belt and Road at the same time that Mr. Biden was offering a $100 billion investment in wars, naming specifically Russia, meaning Ukraine, Israel, the genocide being carried out against the Palestinians, and China. They included Taiwan as one of the places where this $100 billion. So it's pretty clear that they're talking about a global war. And the only question is, how can this madness be stopped and reversed?
Well, it is so unacceptable, American foreign policy. And what I hope people are coming to understand is that the arrogance and the militarization of the United States that has been demonstrated time and again now over the past 30 years is not bringing security to the U.S. It has busted the budget. We've spent trillions of dollars on these horrible wars that have accomplished nothing except violence and destruction and rising debt. And they're not making America safer at all. There are more and more wars that are a reflection of this arrogance, because the arrogance has meant that American policymakers have thought, we can do what we want and we don't have to talk with anybody about it. We don't need diplomacy. We just need our military. And the military can't solve political problems. And we're finding out again and again that the military approach doesn't work to solve the deeper problems of humanity, and can't settle political issues. For that, you need politics. You need diplomacy. And I mean politics in the positive sense of getting together to work out arrangements for people to live peacefully together. So I think the failures of American foreign policy are on full display. Also, the ignorance of it, because I would cite our National Security Advisor's statement, Jake Sullivan, about a week before the violence blew up in Israel and Gaza with the Hamas attack and now the bombing of Gaza. Jake Sullivan said, the Middle East is the quietest that it's been in 2 decades. And it shows they don't know anything except what their own imagination is, and they don't understand what's happening around the world. What's happening around the world is that people want a different approach. They want development. They want social justice. They want the chance for decent lives. They don't want the militarized approach. Mike, we're going to have to go. Great to speak with you, and I have a call starting right now. Kennedy came to realize that he was trapped by his advisors, and that the only 2 people that could save the world were himself and Khrushchev, even facing down their own advisors. And they reached an agreement, of course, one that was only publicly understood decades later, because the agreement was a compromise. It was diplomacy. It was that the Soviet Union would withdraw its missiles from Cuba, and the United States would withdraw its missiles from Turkey. And of course, Kennedy, and I always say, don't complain about someone who saved the world, but he did make it a little complicated for us afterwards, because we didn't understand it was a compromise. We thought it was a showdown that Kennedy had won, a game of chicken that he had won. But in fact, it was a diplomatic compromise, and it saved the world. But that 1 second away from disaster that I mentioned is a story that we only came to know roughly 40 years later, and it's told in detail in Sherwin's book. And that is the story of the disabled submarine on the bottom of the Caribbean, out of communication with Moscow, out of communication with the world. And in trouble, disabled, with a breakdown of its system so that the heat inside had risen, if I remember correctly, well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Sailors were keeling over, and they did not know what to do because their orders were to remain submerged. So the captain finally decides that they have to rise, not knowing what is above, and this is observed by the U.S. Navy nearby, and a Navy plane swoops by, and a real jackass on the plane wanted to have some fun, and instead of dropping depth charges, he dropped live hand grenades on the submarine, thinking that this was fun. And the captain decided that they were under attack and that there was a war underway on the surface. And it happened to be the one submarine in a squadron of 7 in the Caribbean that was carrying nuclear-tipped submarines, nuclear-tipped torpedoes. So he ordered the torpedo bay to be filled with this nuclear-tipped torpedo and gave the order to fire. It happened that on this one submarine, which was the lead of the squadron, there was one party official who was senior to the captain. And he countermanded the order. He said, I don't think we should fire. We should surface. That is what saved the world. That was after the agreement was reached between Kennedy and Khrushchev. That was 2 days afterwards. Kennedy had a famous line that there's always one son of a bitch that doesn't get the message about people not following orders or going off course. This was somebody who didn't get the message because they were in a disabled submarine. But under U.S. nuclear doctrine in 1962, any attack by any nuclear weapon was called upon to unleash the full nuclear arsenal of the United States. By the way, not just on all targets in Russia, but in all targets in the, quote, communist world, China, Central Europe, Eastern Europe. You were there. My wife in Prague those days. Anyway, it didn't matter where you were because we learned 30 years later that everyone would have died from the nuclear winter, no matter not the 700 million that our policymakers had rationally concluded would be the desired outcome of this strike in retaliation. And don't think that it wouldn't have happened because the head of the nuclear forces at the time was none other than Curtis LeMay, and subsequently made famous in Dr. Strangelove. And we've had a lot of true unstable, dangerous people in power, and he was one of them, and no doubt would have seen through this order because he considered Kennedy a traitor and basically said so in open insubordination, that Kennedy was weak and soft and was afraid of attacking and was holding back the attack on Cuba. We also know, by the way, incidentally, that every bit of intelligence about how many soldiers there were, which missile systems were already installed, what would have happened, were all wrong because the CIA rarely gets anything right from what I've observed in the last 75 years. And this was yet another case of the CIA getting almost everything wrong. Well, that brings me to the speech because Kennedy had saved the world with Khrushchev, and they both deserve the credit for saving the world because Khrushchev was also an outstanding human being. And in fact, though he had this harebrained idea of putting missiles in Cuba, when he told Gromyko, his foreign minister, of this idea, Gromyko said, "What do you want, war?" And he said, "War? No, nothing to do with war. This is to show the Americans a little bit of their own medicine. That's all, just to put their nose in it, not war. And that really was Khrushchev. He was a man of peace. And so Kennedy and Khrushchev in 1963 entered a kind of peace tango during the year, and Kennedy was determined to pull the world back from the brink. And he was, in 1963, he was certainly the greatest president and statesman of the post-war period. It was a year of true political genius of Kennedy. He grew to something we had not seen since Franklin Roosevelt, and to my count, almost never in American leadership. He became a great person. So when we remember him as great, sometimes the historians say, oh, not so great, he didn't pass his legislation and so forth. He was great. He saved the world, and he brought the world back from the brink of nuclear war. And in doing so in 1963, he had an incredible insight, which is for us so important. And his insight was that to make peace, it was the United States and the attitudes in the United States that were the most important challenge that he had to overcome. His speech on June 10, 1963, which I've made my family listen to at least 75 times. So I ask each of you to listen to it at least once, because it's mesmerizing. The commencement speech at American University is a speech directed not to the Soviet Union, not making threats, not saying how tough we are, not saying we will never back down, but a speech to the American people saying we need to understand we can make peace with the other side. And think about this. He's saying this 9 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis. It would be like Biden going on television tonight and say, you know, we really need to make peace with Russia right now, which he should do and will never do. But it's like that, only much more so, because this was the height of the Cold War. Incidentally, in writing that speech, he and his closest counselor and magnificent speechwriter and advisor, Ted Sorensen, kept the draft secret from all the bureaucracy until the final weekend, because he knew the Joint Chiefs would try to stop it. The intelligence community would try to stop it. The State Department would try to stop it. And he wanted to speak straight to the American people. So the speech is something unbelievable. And you heard some words about it. What kind of peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, not the peace of the grave, but the peace that makes life worth living. And he told the American people, we need to understand the other side are human beings, and they love their families like we do. And the Russian people are filled with valor and filled with heroism and filled with culture and science, and that Russia experienced devastation in World War II, tantamount to the complete destruction of the United States from the Atlantic to Chicago, and explain to the American people that other powers will also observe treaties if those treaties are in their interest as well, so that we can actually negotiate a treaty with those people. It's unbelievable. Not one demand of the Soviet Union, not a word of bluster, really an appeal directly to the minds and the hearts of the American people. And he explained so many things. He explained what leadership is. He said, by defining our goal of peace more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. So he wanted that goal, and he wanted to make it tangible. And for him, it was the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty that he wanted as the first concrete step of drawing back from the brink. And he explained that there's no magic solution to peace. He said, peace is a process, a way of solving problems. And this is also magnificently wise. And in my favorite lines of the speech, he said, so let us not be blind to our differences, but let us direct attention to those differences and to the means by which they can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. Well, when he gave this speech, Khrushchev received it, received the translation, and immediately called the U.S. envoy, Kennedy's envoy to Moscow, Averell Harriman. And he said to Harriman, this is the finest speech by an American president since FDR. I want to make peace with your president. 5 weeks later, they signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. 60 years ago. And Kennedy had the most magnificent words about it. This is your second homework assignment. His speech at the UN General Assembly on September 20th, 1963. Because there is Kennedy at the rostrum and all the world leaders in front of him and all the world leaders listening to him. And he says, you know, this does not end our conflicts. This does not end war, but the clouds have lifted a little bit. We can see a ray of sunshine passing through the clouds. And he ends the speech by saying that Archimedes is said to have told his friends, give me a place to stand and I can move the world, in explaining the principle of the lever. And then Kennedy looked out at the world leaders and he said, my fellow citizens of the world, let us take our stand here, in our time, in this place, and see if we can move the world toward peace. Well, there was rapture in the room. There was peace for that moment on the planet. And of course, they killed him a few weeks later, probably for this initiative, because it was most likely rogue agents within the US government that did this, probably from the CIA. In my judgment, after studying this for 40 years. But Kennedy set us on a path that did not end with his death, though Johnson had none of this insight and spirit and humanity that Kennedy had. Kennedy was really something special, and especially in that last year had reached absolute global greatness. But what Kennedy had set in place was a process towards stopping the nuclear arms race. It was a very hard and tortuous process, of course, but the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963 set the stage for the Non-Proliferation Treaty just a few years later. Without the first, there could not have been the second. And it was actually Kennedy's game plan. Of course, he hoped to negotiate, the Non-Proliferation Treaty as the follow-up treaty to the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And then, despite all of our horrible mistakes in this country, in the Vietnam War and the destruction of Southeast Asia, the bombing of Laos and Cambodia, destruction of Vietnam, and so many other horrible blunders, there did come the period of nuclear arms control talks and détente, and the beginnings with the SALT Treaty and then follow-up treaties to begin to get this under control. And of course, when Kennedy spoke and gave the peace speech, he estimated, his advisors estimated, that there would be 30 to 40 nuclear nations within 25 years. And successfully, that was limited, not successfully enough, but limited to the 9 nuclear nations today, much less proliferation than was expected. I think it's notable that Kennedy set a process in place that lasted roughly 30 years, and it created the basis for détente and for nuclear arms control, and eventually a basis for Gorbachev to make giant steps forward in peace. And I came into this story a little bit myself professionally as Gorbachev came to power, because in those days, for an economist, watching the reforms of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe was really something quite special. So I got to see Gorbachev's Soviet Union in motion in 1987, 88, and in 1989, Gorbachev helped to engineer basically the end of the dictatorships in Central and Eastern Europe. By the way, just worth mentioning, because great people need to be appreciated, I advised the first Polish government after the communist era, and helped them with their economic strategy, and helped them actually with the political strategy from going from the Solidarity movement to the elections that took place in June 1989 to forming the first government. So I got to watch that process with very high clarity. And one day, one of the lead dissidents, now famous and heroic person named Adam Michnik, if people know him, he was one of Lech Wałęsa's top advisors and has been editor of the main newspaper, free newspaper in Poland for the last 34 years. I called him and said in July 1989, a month before the transition to the post-communist government, I said, how are your negotiations going? He said, Jeff, you know who I just spoke to on the phone? I said, no. Gorbachev. Gorbachev called me. Gorbachev called the dissident advisor to Lech Wałęsa. And Gorbachev said, you people should join the government. You should get in the government. I'm going to talk to Jaruzelski about that. So Gorbachev helped to create the coalition government that came into office in August 1989. He was a magnificent man, Mikhail Gorbachev, the greatest statesman of our age. And he had an idea that we could have an era of peace. And he called it our common European home. And he talked about a common home stretching from Rotterdam to Vladivostok. And I believed it, and believe it till today, that was the right approach. And he asked me Gorbachev asked me to join his economic team, which I did, and my job was to try to help raise some emergency financing from the US government to help a tottering Soviet economy that was in a profound financial crisis. And I had learned from John Maynard Keynes in the 20th century that you help countries in crisis so that they don't turn around and create crises later on. Keynes had warned against the harsh Versailles Treaty in 1919, worrying that it would bring to power in the next generation some horrors. And he, of course, was prescient in that. So I believed the same thing. I found that the US was completely immovable in any kind of help for Gorbachev, any kind of financial help at all. Gorbachev, of course, fell from power in that putsch in August 1989, and Yeltsin came to dominance in Russia. And Yeltsin's economic advisor, who became Prime Minister Yegor Gaidar, asked me to help. So I got to watch that a little bit close up. And what Yeltsin said to me on several occasions in 1989, we just want to be normal. We want to be a normal country again. This is very compelling. And I explained in my full innocence, President Yeltsin will help. You know, maybe they couldn't understand to help the Soviet Union. That was just a leap of imagination too far for the American leadership. But a new post-communist Russia, of course they're going to help. Have no worry, I said. And of course, there was no help at all that came from the United States. I won't belabor at this late hour anyway, all of the dreadful missed opportunities. But the mindset of the US then was something that I would only come to understand over the following 30 years. So this carries us 30 years from Kennedy. Now I want to carry the next 30 years briefly, if I can. Basically, the United States could not take yes for an answer. In 1989, 1991, 1993, we had peace at our fingertips for the world. We had cooperation with Russia, completely possible. We were the world's sole superpower, the indispensable nation, Madeleine Albright told us. But we couldn't take the idea of peace seriously, because it was in that moment that the new crowd came in and took power. The ones that are in power until today, because it's been pretty much a continuous 30 years of what I think we can call the neocon ascension that started in the mid-1990s and that continues in power today. And if there's one constant, if you wanted to see the face of that, it's our Deputy Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland. She's been everywhere. She's been Cheney's advisor. She's been Bush's ambassador. She's been Hillary Clinton's advisor. She's now Biden's she was under Secretary of State. Now she's Deputy Secretary of State. Now, what couldn't they take yes about? They could not take yes that we could have a normal, respectful relationship with Russia. And after China's rise, that we could have a normal, respectful relationship with China. Because the project of the new American century, of Mr. Robert Kagan, Victoria's husband, and the project of this group, and basically it's the project of the military-industrial complex as well, the ones that are just as happy to be part of this, is that the United States needs to dominate the world in order to have peace, not just cooperate with the world. And this is the fundamental hubris and the fundamental assertion of power that has brought us to where we are today. We are not in danger because Russia was hostile, nor because Putin was hostile when he became president. Russia was not hostile, and Putin was not hostile. And Putin was not dreaming of reconstructing the Russian Empire or whatever little bit of silly propaganda we get fed each day. Russia wanted normalcy, wanted respect and normalcy. China would like respect and normalcy. Instead, we decided to surround Russia first and then China now with our military bases all around their borders and to flood the space with our military power because we are the indispensable nation. So rather than Kennedy's message, let's look inside and understand we can make peace with the other side, which even in the height of the Cold War succeeded, even when we had peace on our platter, when they had ended all claims and conflicts, we couldn't accept that. So as people probably know, in 1990, James Baker III, our Secretary of State at the time, and Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the Foreign Minister of Germany, solemnly promised to Gorbachev repeatedly during 1990, NATO will never move eastward. By the way, you no doubt read all the time that this is false, but it's true. And there's a long archive of materials demonstrating, which I'd be happy to send to anybody, or you can just look it up at the George Washington University National Securities Archive. To make an interesting but long story short, starting with President Clinton, starting with the project for a new American century, really starting with the neocons in the last year of the Bush administration, with Wolfowitz and Cheney and Rumsfeld, but then taken on because it's basically the military-industrial complex by the Clinton administration in the mid-1990s, championed by Madeleine Albright and Richard Holbrooke. NATO enlargement started. So we couldn't take peace for an answer. Rather than disbanding NATO, which would have been an absolutely plausible and right thing to do, we started to enlarge contrary to our promises. 3 countries expanded in 1999, Hungary, Czech Republic, Poland, but then came George Bush and we went on NATO expansion on steroids, so that in 2004, 7 more countries joined NATO: Romania, Bulgaria, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Now you have the Black Sea and you have the Baltic states. And our idea was surround Russia, maybe break apart Russia. That would be nice. Decolonize Russia, as it came to be called, was the neocon idea. And the Russians, I know them, they kept saying, would you stop? You told us nothing. No expansion, not an inch eastward was the line. Now you're in the Baltic Sea, you're in the Black Sea, you're in the Baltic states, you're in the Balkans. What next? Well, George W. Bush Jr. gave them the next in 2008, when he faced down what was pretty good sense by the Europeans and insisted that NATO commit to expanding to Ukraine and to Georgia. And this was fulfilling a plan of Zbig-Brzezinski, that if we could surround Russia in the Black Sea region, we would end Russia's power, essentially, power projection in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. And the Russians were saying, this is impossible. We're never going to allow ourselves to be surrounded. This is our naval fleet in Sevastopol, which you read about each day, is our attack of missiles and a HIMARS bomb Sevastopol today. We're not going to allow that to happen. And in the meantime, under the same project,
not only did we do that, but we unilaterally abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which was certainly the single most destabilizing act since Kennedy's partial nuclear test ban treaty. It ended up unraveling all of the nuclear agreements because the United States said, we'll put missiles where we want and when we want them, and it's nobody's business. And of course, we put the Aegis missile systems into Romania and Poland over the vociferous objections of Russia. And that, as much as anything, is why we have the war in Ukraine today. So we could not take yes for an answer. And the Russians kept saying, stop. Well, Ukraine elected a president in 2010 who said, this is getting too hot. We'll be neutral, thank you. Thank you, we'll be neutral. That was Viktor Yanukovych. Well, that drove the neocons crazy. So they knew they had to overthrow him. And when the opportunity arose in February 2014, Victoria Nuland was our point person to overthrow Yanukovych. And it was a violent coup stirred by the United States. I happened to see some of it close up. It was quite ugly. And some of you, probably all of you, have heard Victoria Nuland on tape 3 weeks before the violent events describing who would be the next prime minister. Very weird, very unpleasant. We have a way of not discussing any of this in this country, by the way. So not any of this background has been discussed by the New York Times in its coverage of this crisis during this whole period. I can tell you because I complain to them almost daily. And my fantasy is canceling my New York Times subscription after 60 years, but I can't bring myself to do it. All I do is just read it with disgust, but we still subscribe. In any event, this is what has brought us to where we are today. We have unilaterally abandoned all of the nuclear agreements. Others have expired. Others we never were willing to ratify, like the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. It's been 30 years when the United States said no to peace. So for 30 years, we dug out of the Cold War from 1963 to 1993. And from 1993 to 2023, we recreated the Cold War. And we're in two hot wars today because of this hubris and this arrogance. It is not because Russia is an implacable foe. It is not because Putin is a vicious megalomaniac dreaming of recreating the Russian Empire. These events never had to take place. The United States has rejected every opportunity to negotiate, including two that people should understand. One was December 17, 2021. Putin put on the table a draft US-Russia agreement to avoid a war. It said NATO will not enlarge to Ukraine. I called Jake Sullivan and said, Jake, you better negotiate. It was the one and last time he took my call. And I spent an hour trying to describe why there was one way out of this, and I've seen this for 30 years, and we're making a big mistake, and it's time to negotiate. Well, the U.S. gave the formal response to Putin on January 26th, I believe it is 2022, when they said, NATO expansion is none of your business and it is non-negotiable. That's our official policy, that U.S. expansion of NATO to Ukraine is literally none of Russia's business. So we do what we want, and we expect that this is going to lead something desirable or to our security. And of course, it leads to exactly the opposite. I won't keep you longer, except to say that China, the situation with China is the same. We decided 10 years ago we need to contain China. Good luck with that.
the main trading partner of virtually all the world, the low-cost provider of most of the key green technologies that the world needs, a country that has made stupendously successful and impressive efforts to escape from poverty that itself was largely caused by the outside world, by 2 opium wars, by the extraterritorial claims of the European and US powers, by the Japanese invasions. And they escape from poverty, and instead of a nice word, every word is bad-mouthing China. He's a dictator, he's a this, he's a that. Again, we can't take yes for an answer. We have to seemingly create the enemies, to have our enemies, and to expand our military everywhere. We were just in Australia, we were in Taiwan a couple of months ago. That's the Ukraine of the coming years if we continue on this policy. We say, we'll arm you to make you safe. If we send arms to Taiwan, we will make them the bullseye, believe me. It's the stupidest thing in the world we could do, would be to arm Taiwan the way we're talking about doing. And it would be the most suicidal for them to accept it, but they probably will. It's hard not to accept that. That's what Ukraine discovered too late. We have your back. Right now, ladies and gentlemen, we don't have anybody's back, not even our own. We don't have Israel's back. We don't have anybody's back. The world has changed so much that we can't keep anybody safe. We can't even keep the American people safe the way we're going. The world does not abide by our foreign policy. The world does not accept NATO enlargement. The world does not accept what Biden said or did in the last 2 days in Israel. The world sees things in a different way. They don't want one hegemonic power. They want political solutions. They want a Palestinian state. So do I. Why not after 60 years of this? So they understand that this is about politics. They understand it was not a good idea for the US to push NATO to Ukraine and to Georgia. They understand it was not a good idea for Nancy Pelosi to fly to Taiwan, that doesn't make Taiwan safe, that makes Taiwan endangered. That's how the world sees this. So let me speak 1 minute about the next 30 years. We had a good 30 years that President Kennedy started, not good in every way, but good in the sense of beginning to get this nuclear demon back under control. We had another 30 years of American hubris that has brought us to war and geopolitical tensions that are unrivaled since the height of the Cold War, and according to the doomsday clock, are even worse than during the Cold War, because we had also the environmental catastrophes that are on our doorstep at the same time as the geopolitical risks that we face. So we never before were 90 seconds to midnight, not even in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But what we have seen is it's possible to change course. This is, as we say in economics, this is endogenous. This is not something that comes from the outside. This is a choice for us to make. As Kennedy said, the ability to achieve peace depends on our own thinking even more than the other side. Depends on our own attitudes towards peace. And so this is why the work of this wonderful foundation is so essential. As Kennedy said, we are not gripped by forces that we cannot control. Our problems are man-made, and therefore they can be solved by man. This is a group that can help and is helping to decisively lead to the change of worldview. I can tell you outside, there is every possibility of making peace. Peace with China is possible. Peace with Russia is possible. There are no implacable foes outside. Peace with Iran is possible. What they want is respect from the United States. What they want is not to be crowded by missiles and military bases and regime change operations and the CIA by the United States. And I couldn't agree with them more. So please, ladies and gentlemen, we have a lot of work to do. You are leaders. I'm with you. And I'm sure that we can change the trajectory and make a path towards peace. Thank you.